When we don't give rage a voice,
It finds another way to speak, and that's through resentment, and that's through self-sabotage. Maybe it's chronic stress or an explosive outburst. And of course, in many people, it shows up as an illness.
hey there, this is Women on the Brink. I'm your host, Chris Jeffrey, a registered acupuncturist and wellness advisor with a passion for helping women live happier and more balanced lives. When I'm away from work, I'm usually outside in nature, either walking the seawall or I'm hiking in the mountains. And like many of you, my life has been filled with moments of hardship, some that I thought I couldn't overcome and really left me questioning my own strength. But through these challenges, I discovered resilience, courage, and a renewed sense of purpose. So I'm here to share not just my journey, but the lessons I've learned, and to remind you that no matter what obstacles come your way, there's always a path forward. And just to let you know, this podcast is not prescriptive, it's an offering. So please take what resonates with you and leave the rest.
Hi, and welcome back to Women on the Brink. This is a space for the woman who's not falling apart, she's just waking up. And today we're stepping into something many of us were taught to avoid or suppress or to fear, and that is rage. Not irritability, not annoyance, not frustration wrapped in politeness. I mean the deep, volcanic kind of rage that bubbles up from somewhere primal and says, no fucking more. Wow, you go, girl. This kind of anger, we've been taught, is dangerous, inappropriate, and unfeminine, unladylike. But what if rage isn't a problem to fix, but instead acts as our compass? Like, what if it's trying to point us somewhere where we've been too conditioned or too afraid to look? I mean, rage, especially in women, is often the unspoken language of unmet needs, of generational grief, of boundaries repeatedly being crossed. And it's what happens when your nervous system has screamed, this isn't right, 1,000 quiet times, and nobody listened, including you. So rage tells the truth when your voice has been silenced. And here's the key. Rage isn't just about the world outside of you. It lives in the feminine shadow. And that's the part of ourselves we've pushed underground to stay safe and liked and acceptable. So many of us anyway, we were raised to disown this anger and to just smile through this kind of pain. And we've been told that a good woman is calm and she's composed and she's forgiving and she's small. So we contort ourselves into the palatable versions of who we are. But these parts that we send into exile, they don't disappear. They don't go anywhere. They don't go away. They ferment. So for me, my pattern would be like if something bothered me, I just tried to let it go. And I didn't speak up because I knew that an argument might start with the other person, or I might be seen as being difficult. Or sometimes I was so gaslit that I started to believe that there was something really wrong with me. But what I found is that when I was dismissing these situations as small issues, I realized that so many of my boundaries were being crossed by different people. And I didn't feel respected, and I didn't feel heard, and I definitely didn't feel loved or appreciated. And what would happen is after I'd let things go several times, I suddenly, maybe even over something that appeared not super significant, I would just lose my shit and become very reactive. And I think this is common. I mean, we sometimes don't realize how much anger starts to burst out of this deep place from within us. And, to make matters worse, this expressed rage will often result in remorse and shame and guilt. So, what should I have done with this rage? Well, now that I understand it more deeply, and as I had touched on in a previous episode about liver qi stagnation, I know the answer isn't to push it down or pretend it's not there. Because in traditional Chinese medicine, we're taught to honor emotions like anger and rage, and to be curious about them, and to let them act as a flashlight instead of a flamethrower. Because when the rage shows up, it's not random, it's pointing to something sacred being violated. So that could be a core value or an unmet need or a boundary that's been crossed. It's not just an outburst, it's a call to pay attention to the parts of me that have been silenced or split off. And that's where the shadow work comes in. And if you're not familiar with shadow work, it's really the process of gently turning toward those parts of ourselves we buried because we were told that they were too much or too messy or just unacceptable. And it's about bringing those emotions into the light with compassion so they can be acknowledged and integrated. And that's where the true healing begins, not with numbing or managing emotions, but by meeting ourselves fully and honestly. And I mean, let's be real, it's not easy work. Sometimes it feels like staring into a pit of snakes, but it's also the work that frees us, and that work realigns us with who we really are. And I really want to be clear here. This isn't about rage as a form of destruction. It's really about rage as reclamation. It's about learning to speak without apologizing, to set a boundary and not collapsing into those feelings of guilt and shame. And it's about letting your anger guide you back to that aliveness you used to feel. Because when a woman reclaims her rage, she's not becoming less spiritual or less loving. She's actually allowing herself to become whole again. And so that feeling of rage is a part of her that should not be ignored or invisible. So if you're on the brink right now, or maybe you're yelling, you're quitting, you're crying in the car, or you're walking away from something you can't pretend about anymore, I want you to know that you are not crazy. You are coming alive, and rage is not the end, it's just the beginning. So stay with us after the break. I'm going to share how I learned to work with my rage, not against it, and how I began channeling it into something healing.
Join us on our website for articles from our podcasts at www.womenonthebrink.net. There you'll find extra tools that can be used to raise self-awareness and build resilience. We want to make this experience as interactive as possible for you Brinkers. So join the forums, introduce yourself, and share your stories.
So, you know that feeling when something swells in your chest or your throat tightens or there's a hot kind of buzzing behind your ears and you feel like you might just erupt? That's not just irritation. It's your internal alarm system going off, and it's pulling you back towards your boundaries. And it's really signaling your unmet needs and reminding you that it's time to speak from your emotions instead of burying them. And the root of rage usually isn't what set you off this morning. Mm-mm. It's what's been quietly simmering for years, as it was with me. Maybe it's the fifth time your ideas were dismissed in a meeting, but it carries the weight of every time you've been talked over. Oh my God, I so hate being talked over. Maybe you feel underestimated or you're expected to work twice as hard for half the credit. Maybe you lashed out at your partner for forgetting something small, but underneath is the exhaustion of carrying the emotional weight of your whole household from the layers of letting it go that never really went anywhere. And when we don't give it a voice, it finds another way to speak. And that's through resentment, and that's through self sabotage. Maybe it's chronic stress or an explosive outburst. And of course, in many people, it shows up as an illness. But there is another way. You learn to catch rage before it burns everything down. So for me, I started by pausing, not to suppress it, but to feel it fully and safely. And I got curious because I really believe that curiosity is one of our best tools for managing stress. And so I asked it, like, what am I here to protect? Or maybe, what truth have I been avoiding all this time? And I kept trying to give it a voice without a filter. And once I could name it, I'd scream into a pillow or I'd go for a run. And I'm really, really fortunate because I have great friends and coaches that I can call who can hold what it is I'm feeling without trying to fix me. So, I could let it come out without it really needing to look pretty. Because when rage is expressed with awareness, not unleashed recklessness or shoved down out of fear, it has the power to transform. And it can become clarity. It can become the fuel for new boundaries, more aligned choices, and a deeper sense of self respect. And what I've found is that when I'm able to process it with someone safe, someone who can hold that space without judgment, the intensity often softens. And when I have the courage to express it respectfully and directly to the person involved without blame, the change can dissolve completely. And, I believe I can name my rage. Again, it's not random and it's not about one thing. For me, I think it stems from layers of injustice. There's the injustice, I've lived through personally, the times I've been dismissed or overlooked or stretched too thin or expected to swallow my truth just to keep the peace. And then there's the injustice I witness every day in the world, toward women, toward marginalized communities, toward the earth. And then there's the inheritance, the emotional lineage that I carry, even if I didn't fully understand it up until quite recently. So, what I found out is that both my grandmothers, on my mother's side and on my father's side, had what were referred to at the time as a nervous breakdown. Both of them had them after raising 4 children. So, let's call it what it was: total collapse under the weight of unacknowledged rage, exhaustion, emotional suppression, and zero support. Back then there was no language for burnout. There was no safe space to talk about overwhelm, no room for women to say, I can't do this anymore, without being labeled unstable. And that silence, that unspoken suffering, it didn't go away. It didn't disappear. It got passed down. And I believe some of that pain lives in me, and not as a curse, but more as a call for change. I feel a deep calling to give voice to what the women before me couldn't say and to feel the emotions they were forced to bury. And by doing so, I begin a new story where my rage becomes a catalyst for healing rather than something to fear or suppress. And I'm beginning to see that this is how I start to break that generational chain or cycle. And so, once again, the rage dissipates. I'm able to respond from an emotionally higher state, not just from the pain. And I think I'm now able to make decisions based on what my values and beliefs are, not in guilt or in guilt avoidance. And I stopped apologizing for being too much and started recognizing and actually honoring just how much that I have been carrying. So this is not about becoming more angry. It's about becoming more aware. And through this awareness, I'm living a life that no longer requires me to suppress or to shrink or to snap. And I'll give you an example of this. So one morning in the park, a friend and I were sitting with our coffees and we were pretty deep in conversation. And this woman came and sat down beside us and began talking on her phone to her friend. And it was really, really, really loud. And it quickly became quite invasive because it was just drowning out our own conversation. So instead of ignoring the discomfort I was feeling or, stewing silently and just becoming resentful, I decided to say something. So I just simply asked her if she could keep her voice down a little. And to my surprise, she wasn't defensive or offended, and she just nodded and complied. And I guess, it was the way I approached her. I was calm and I was trying to do it respectfully so that we kept things peaceful. And that moment reminded me, when we express our needs in the moment without blame, we're not just managing our energy, we're also preventing those flickers of irritation from snowballing into, deeper resentment or emotional backlog. Because anger and frustration and irritability and resentment can turn to rage. But when they're heard and held, it doesn't destroy, it actually directs. So now I'm going to tell you another little story about my experience going into an anger room here in Vancouver. And if you haven't heard of these places, imagine a space where you're handed a baseball bat, goggles, and protective gear, and then left alone with a pile of my room had old printers, TVs, glassware, and these horrible cement walls. It's really not a pretty place. Oh, and yes, you're given permission. You're given permission to swing and scream and smash and release whatever you've been holding on to. So it was raw. It was pretty weird. And it was probably one of the strangest things I've done in a long, long time. And if you aren't familiar with anger rooms, they started gaining popularity in the early 2000s. I think the first well-known one opened in Japan as a response to corporate burnout. And since then, they popped up in cities all over the world, New York, Toronto, here in Vancouver, because people are starting to recognize that we don't have many safe, sanctioned places to feel our anger, especially women. And apparently women use the anger rooms more than men, which, I don't know, kind of makes sense because rage isn't just inconvenient for us women. It's taboo to show it publicly. So when I left that room, my body felt a little lighter, but my mind was really buzzing and I realized, rage isn't my enemy. It's just freaking information. It's just some kind of sacred alarm system. And we don't need to be afraid of it. We just need to learn to listen and understand why it's there in the first place. So, rage may not exist in every woman in the same way, but for many, it lives somewhere beneath the surface. Whether it's just a simmer or a spark or an ache, it doesn't necessarily show up as explosive anger, but as exhaustion or resentment, anxiety, or as I mentioned, illness. And this isn't because women are inherently angry, but because so many of us have been conditioned to suppress our anger in order to be liked or accepted or safe. So over generations, the accumulation of unspoken truths, of unmet needs and systemic inequality can settle into the body like sediment. So while not every woman really identifies with the word rage, many women will carry the weight of unacknowledged emotion that has never had a safe place to land. So if you're feeling on the brink, not a burnout today, but maybe a boiling over, know that you're not broken. You're just tuning in. And just ask yourself, what am I furious about, but maybe too afraid to say out loud? And what part of me have I disowned to stay safe and likable and good? And what would it look like to stop apologizing for my anger and start listening to it instead? So as we close today, remember this, the emotions we often try to push down, this anger, resentment, irritation, annoyance, they're all messengers. And as I mentioned in the episode on liver chi stagnation, addressing these feelings as they arise is essential because not only does it honor the throat chakra, which is our energetic center for truth and expression, but it also helps release the emotional heat before it turns into full-blown fire. And in traditional Chinese medicine, this is the progression of liver chi stagnation into fire, and it's exactly why we're trying to prevent it. So when we tend to our emotions in real time, we don't just protect our energy, we preserve our health and our peace. So again, I want to emphasize this is not about being dramatic. It's not about being selfish. It's maintenance. It's emotional, energetic human maintenance. And the more we do it, the less of it we carry. And please share this episode with a woman who needs to hear this message. And keep those emails coming to womenonthebrink.net@gmail.com. I love hearing from you all.
Thanks for joining. And I want you to know that this isn't just a podcast. This is a movement. So share this information with your friends and let's go, ladies.